So, last night's State of the Union, wow. It was really a tale of two Americas, wasn't it? You had two leaders from two different parties telling two completely different stories about the state of the nation. We're going to break down what the president said, what the official response was, and, what it all actually means.
Okay, let's just jump right in. On one side, you have the president declaring, "Our country is winning again." Total victory. But on the other, you have the direct rebuttal, "We did not hear the truth." I mean, these two quotes, they perfectly sum up the clashing realities that were presented to everyone on one single night. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to dig into the president's vision of a golden age. Then, we'll pivot and analyze the governor's counterargument. After that, we'll put it all together and look at the two competing visions for America that emerged. And finally, we'll talk about what this all means for the big elections coming up in November. All right, first up, President Trump's address. Now, with his approval ratings hovering under 40% and a lot of scrutiny on his policies, he didn't really give a traditional State of the Union. Instead, it felt like full-on campaign mode, kind of like a mix between a rally for his base and a primetime award ceremony. This right here was the central theme of his entire speech. He painted this picture of a country that he single-handedly rescued from crisis. He was claiming a historic, unbelievable transformation, directly pushing back against all the talk of a slowing economy and rising inflation.
And to back up these huge claims, he used some big, impressive-sounding numbers. For instance, he boasted that his administration had lifted a record 2.4 million Americans off of food stamps in just 1 year. And on the surface, wow, that sounds like a massive victory against poverty, right?
But, and this is a really important but, you have to look at the details. That word lifted is doing a lot of work in that sentence. These 2.4 million people had their food assistance benefits cut. So yeah, they were removed from the program, but that absolutely does not mean they were suddenly lifted out of poverty.
And the whole tone of the night was less presidential address and more game show host. I mean, he used this kind of over-the-top language to describe a nation that's just so incredibly successful, so victorious that people just can't handle it anymore. And this really set the stage for what came next.
The speech then literally turned into an awards show. The president was on stage, presenting the Presidential Medal of Freedom, multiple Purple Hearts, a Legion of Merit, and 2 Medals of Honor. He even talked out loud about how he wanted a Medal of Honor for himself, which, is a pretty unusual thing for any president to say. But underneath all that celebration and all those awards, there was a very sharp political strategy at play. The real goal wasn't just to talk up his administration's wins. It was to create this intense, in-group loyalty by drawing a really clear, hard line between us and a dangerous them.
And this quote is a perfect example of that tactic in action. He used lines just like this to force a televised moment of division. He'd demand everyone stand, creating this powerful visual of his supporters on their feet and his political opponents sitting down, casting them in that moment as somehow un-American.
This kind of dynamic isn't actually new. The philosopher Eric Hoffer talked all about it in his theory of the true believer. It's this idea that once followers commit to a strongman-type leader, their loyalty actually gets stronger as his behavior gets more extreme. They don't pull away, they double down to prove their loyalty.
Okay, so now let's flip the coin and look at the official response, which tried to build a completely different narrative. Delivered by Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger, this wasn't just a reaction. It was an attempt to paint an alternate vision of America, shifting the focus away from the president and onto the people. She opened not with attacks, but with a history lesson. She framed her entire speech around this core American idea that citizens have the power and the right to hold their leaders accountable. She immediately positioned her whole argument not as partisan, but as a patriotic duty. And her entire rebuttal was basically structured around this one simple, powerful question. It was a direct appeal to everyone watching at home, asking them to check the president's grand claims against the actual reality of their own daily lives. So while the president was declaring a golden age, Governor Spanberger was busy building her case on kitchen table economics. She was pointing to things like the rising cost of housing and healthcare, the impact of tariffs on small businesses, and specific laws that she argued were hurting rural families and kids.
And maybe the starkest contrast of the whole night was on immigration enforcement, where the president praised federal agents. The governor, who is a former law enforcement officer herself, argued that those very same agents were terrorizing communities and acting without any real accountability. This quote really sums up her whole position. Her argument was that, yes, the country's immigration system is broken and needs to be fixed, but that's not an excuse for what she called unchecked federal power operating in American neighborhoods.
So when you strip everything else away, all the applause lines, all the politics, what you're left with are two fundamentally different visions for what America is and what it should be. The night wasn't just about policy, it was a battle for the nation's core identity.
And here's where you can really see the conflict laid out, side by side. The president's vision, it's built on an us versus them world, where division is a political tool and the nation is defined by a strongman leader. The governor's vision, it's all about we the people, where unity is the goal and power rests with ordinary citizens. And this brings us to the big question. Why does any of this matter? I mean, they're just speeches, right? Well, not exactly. These two competing stories aren't just talk. They are the battle cries for the midterm elections coming up this November. In making her case, Governor Spanberger basically held up her own election as proof that her vision can work. She pointed out that she won her election by a 15-point margin, getting votes from Democrats, Republicans, and independents. She presented this as evidence that a message of unity can actually be more powerful than one of division. And she closed by quoting the nation's very first president. She brought up George Washington's warning about divisive leaders, but also his call for Americans to unite for a common cause. She basically framed the choice today as a fundamental test of the country's founding principles. And so that's the choice that was laid out for everyone. Is America a nation of winners and losers defined by one strong leader? Or is it a nation of citizens working together to demand more from their government? One night, two completely different speeches. The question now is, which one of these stories will ultimately define the next chapter of the American Union?